questions? Yes.
So last time you showed us how F-theory compactation resulted in tau being dependent on the internal,
Yes.
So would there be regions of the internal space for which tau would correspond to strong coupling?
Yes, there would be.
So wouldn't that be troublesome?
Yeah. So F theory is not a perturbative description, right? Nevertheless, if you have sufficient amount of supersymmetry, okay, one expects that describes some compactification, right? It's not that F theory gives you a way to calculate things in general, right? Because indeed, in some regions, the coupling will be strong, right? Except in some specific circumstances, which we'll discuss. Right? But otherwise, because tau is varying around, varying in the internal space, right? There will be strong coupling regions. So you cannot use normal perturbation theory. Any other questions?
So for finite tau, so should we include some stringy corrections?
Yes, in general you have to, right? But what F theory is useful for, we will see, is to identify, for example, the enhanced gauge symmetries, which is very hard to see otherwise. Okay? Particularly, we will first make the connection between F theory and orientifolds. Okay? But from the orientifold viewpoint, we know that the kind of symmetries that we can get, enhanced symmetries we can get, are SUN, where many of the D-branes coincide, right? Or SON, right? Where the D-brane coincides on an orientifold plane. Okay? But for example, if you want exceptional groups, those are hard to get from the orientifold, right? Or at least hard to get perturbative from orientifold. Okay? F theory, on the other hand, okay, has a way to get these enhanced exceptional gauge symmetries. Okay? And once you understand the connection between F theory and orientifolds, okay, that will show that even the orientifolds can get these exceptional gauge symmetries, even though it's not immediately visible.
So the stringy correction in S theory can be under control.
Well, no, full stringy corrections in F theory is not under control, right? And that's why I said that F theory is usually good for finding enhanced symmetries, enhanced gauge symmetries, right? Which are sufficiently under control. Because if you have sufficient amount of supersymmetry, then the existence of enhanced gauge symmetry, okay, it doesn't go away once you include the stringy corrections or quantum corrections. Okay? But in general, if F theory has regions of strong coupling, okay, we cannot really use perturbative string theory to calculate, for example, the S matrix systematically. Are there other questions?
This base B, why
Yes.
is it not a Calabi-Yau manifold? Because at the end of the day, the type 2B theory is compactified on base B.
Yes. So it is not a Calabi-Yau manifold, because we will see. See, we arrived at the notion that it's a Calabi-Yau manifold by starting with a compactification where no field varies. Right? There you saw that you need Ricci flatness. Okay? And if you also want to maintain supersymmetry, that underlying manifold has to be Calabi-Yau. Okay? Here we are generalizing that situation, right? We are allowing fields to vary. Okay? So in general, there is no reason why the base B has to be Calabi-Yau. Okay? And we will see that in general the base B is not a Calabi-Yau. Okay? Except of course in trivial cases, right? A trivial case of F theory compactification is that when you take the base to be Calabi-Yau, okay, and you take the fiber torus to be just a direct product, right? So instead of having a fibration, you can take the torus to be just constant over the base. Okay? That's also one special example. Okay? But that's basically equivalent to compactifying type 2B on a Calabi-Yau manifold. Okay? So in this sense, the type 2B compactification on Calabi-Yau manifolds also you can think of as an F theory compactification, although it's not very useful. Okay, but and the way you think of it is F theory compactification, you take Calabi-Yau times T2, okay, which is also a Calabi-Yau, and it's elliptically fibered because T2 is fibered over the base Calabi-Yau. Okay. And then if you follow this prescription, that will basically say that you set tau equal to constant over the whole Calabi-Yau, because T2 is because it's a product space, okay, the T2 complex structure remains constant over the Calabi-Yau. But barring those simple cases, okay, typically we will see that the base is not a Calabi-Yau.
And size of T2 in M theory is inversely proportional to the size of S1 in 2B.
That's right, yes.
So this is something because the S1 type 2B on S1 and 2A on S1 tilde, they are related by R is equal to alpha prime by R.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. So if you follow this chain of duality, right, you know precisely how the variables in type 2b are related to the variables in type 2a, right? And you also know how the variables in type 2 are related to variables in M theory, right? So you can follow this chain of dualities to work out the precise relationship between the size of S1 in one description, right, and the size of T2 in the other description, and you can find an exact relationship between them, okay, including what power it goes as.
So where is F theory as such here? I mean, what is F theory here?
Well, no, the point F theory is, as I said, it's more a terminology. Right? You can imagine it there as if there is some underlying 12-dimensional theory that are compactifying on the whole Calabi-Yau, right? But there is really no such an underlying 12-dimensional theory. Right? If you start with a Calabi-Yau manifold which is 2n-dimensional, right, then effectively it corresponds to type 2b compactification on a 2n minus 2 dimensional manifold, right? Because that's the dimension of the base. Okay? But you can imagine as if there is some underlying 12-dimensional theory, and that's what you are compactifying on this Calabi-Yau, on this Calabi-Yau. Right? Okay, so that 12-dimensional hypothetical 12-dimensional theory you can refer to as F theory, but there is really no such theory in 12 dimensions.
So how is it actually implemented? As in, like, if we don't know what the 12-dimensional theory is, how do we carry out any calculations?
Yeah, so so that's what I said, that what you do is that you use this vibration, right, to determine how tau varies as a function of the base. Right? That's the information that you use from the Calabi-Yau. Okay? And then, I mean, you can try to determine the metric on the base, okay, but typically the metric on a Calabi-Yau is not known anyway, so that's not very useful to find the metric on the base. So once you know how tau varies on the base, right, you just solve Einstein's equation directly, okay, to find out what metric will be on the base. Okay? So that's the strategy that one normally follows. That you don't try to use the original Calabi-Yau to determine what the metric is on the base. Right? If you need to know the metric, you just solve Einstein's equation explicitly.
This is supposed to be in your classical limit.
Yes. So these are all in the classical limit, exactly. So as I said, the quantum corrections in F theory are not under control typically because tau has goes to finite values, right, where the situation is strongly coupled. Right? And there is really no systematic procedure for starting with an F theory compactification and understanding how the quantum corrections are computed. Right? But it's a very nevertheless a very useful thing to use because, as I said, some of the symmetry enhancements are much easier to see in the F theory viewpoint than what it would be from other descriptions. Okay, so let me today begin by describing some examples of F theory compactification. Okay, and the one that I will start with is the simplest one. Okay. So F theory on Calabi-Yau 1, F theory on CY1. Okay, what is CY1? It's a T2. This is T2. This is always elliptically fibered. Okay. T2 is T2 fibered over a point. Right? So it's always electrically fibered. So F theory on Calabi-Yau is equivalent to 2B in 10B. And the complex structure of T2, complex structure of T2 gives you tau. Okay, which is constant here. Okay, because T2 is there nothing to vary on. Right? This is the point. Okay, this is the most trivial example, which is not very useful. So we go to the next one now. Okay. Calabi-Yau twofold. This case we will be discussing in detail because we will see that once you understand this, we will understand many of the things for general F theory compactification.
This tau field is the axial tilted field in this.
Yes, so now is the axial tilted field that is equal to the T2 complex structure of T2, right? So you are not going to get any new compactification from this procedure, right? It's just type 2b at 10 dimensions, okay, with some fixed value of tau. Okay, so F theory on Calabi-Yau twofold. Calabi-Yau twofold is K3. It turns out that not all K3 are elliptically fibered. K3 has a moduli space. Okay. Not all of that moduli space, okay, not all K3 everywhere in the moduli space is elliptically fibered, but there is a subspace of the moduli space of K3, okay, where the manifold can be thought of as an elliptically fibered manifold, okay, which means that there is a base, okay, over which the torus is varying. Okay. So a subspace of the moduli space of K3 is elliptically fibered. Elliptically fibered. Over a subspace. And we'll describe how to construct this. But let me give some details. So the base of this elliptic fibration is a two-dimensional surface, right? Because K3 is four-dimensional, so the base is two-dimensional. And it turns out the base in this case is P2, or S2, the two-dimensional sphere. Okay, which you can also think of as CP1, S2 sphere. So this is certainly not Calabi-Yau.
How did we decide that base was H2?
So we'll construct it explicitly, right? So I'm just stating the facts, right? Then we'll describe how to construct this elliptically fibered K3.
From now it's just it should be two dimensional.
Two-dimensional. S2 is two-dimensional, two-dimensional sphere. So it's a two-dimensional sphere on which T2 is varying.
Is there a general algorithm to check whether a manifold is elliptically fibered or not without constructing it?
Well, it's the other way that given an elliptically fibered manifold, right, there is general procedure to check if it's Calabi-Yau or not. Okay, so we'll discuss that. There may be also a reverse algorithm, I'm not completely sure. Right. But given an elliptically fibered manifold, we can check whether it's Calabi-Yau or not. Right? That's the way one can proceed. Okay, so what does this mean? Okay, this means that there is a way to specify tau of z, tau as a function of z. Okay. So that if we now think of tau being tau describing the complex structure of a torus, okay, which is varying on the base, okay, that describes an elliptically fibered, that describes a K3. Okay, so you have to specify tau of z in such a way. Okay. You have to check if it's K3 or not, right? It's already elliptically fibered because I am constructing an elliptically fibered manifold, tau given as a function of z. Okay. But we have to make this dependence of tau on z such, okay, that when we think of this as a torus varying over the base, okay, tau of z giving the complex structure of the torus, this should be K3 surface, okay, K3 manifold. Okay. So this is, we have to check, right? How should tau vary over the base so that eventually we get a K3.
So the K3 will have coordinates of the base plus of the torus.
Of the torus, exactly.
So tau and z.
No, not tau. It will have coordinates z, okay, and coordinates w of the torus. Okay. So w is the coordinate of T2 okay, with the identification that w is w plus 1 is w plus tau of z. Right? Fiber is a torus itself, right? Is this point here? Right? So total space of z and w with an identification of this kind will describe the space, and you want to know under what condition is this Calabi-Yau manifold. In this particular case, whether under what condition is it K3.
That will determine tau as a function of z.
Yeah, that will determine tau. Well, it will not completely determine tau as a function of z, but it will give constraints. Okay? Because this itself has its own moduli space, right? It's not a unique manifold that you will get. Is this question clear? Okay. Now to address this question, okay, it turns out to be more convenient to describe a torus slightly differently from this description. Okay, this is the simplest description of the torus we can think of. Right? Take a plane and periodically identify W coordinate. Right? Take a plane with coordinate or complex coordinate W and then specify what the periodic identification is. Okay? So this is indeed a good description of the torus, but it's not the most convenient one. Okay? For checking under what condition will this be elliptically fibered. Okay, so we are going to describe now. Okay, we are now going to give a different description of the torus of the same space that is given by this. Okay. So this is what is called the Weierstrass form. So we take an equation of the following form: x cube plus fx plus e. So this is of a fixed torus. We are not talking about vibration or anything, of a fixed torus. So f and g are constants. X and y are complex coordinates. X, y, complex coordinates. Okay, find x and y. Yeah, so let's just say x and y are complex coordinates from now. This you can also write as y square equal to x minus x1 times x minus x2 times x minus x3. x1, x2 and x3 are the three roots of this polynomial, of this cubic polynomial. So now let's see what space it describes. First of all, so let's see what is a possible choice of local coordinate system. Right? Suppose you are in some given region of this space. So this is two-dimensional space, right? These two complex variables, one relation. Okay? So it's a two-dimensional space. So you want to argue that this is a torus. Okay? So let's think of this as a two-dimensional space, okay? And ask what kind of coordinate system we can use to describe it. Now it's clear that away from these points, away from x1, x2 and x3, okay, and now as you will see, we will also add infinity to it. Away from these, x is a good local coordinate system, right? Because if you specify x, y is specified up to a sign, okay, but those 2 points are far away. So it's like you have 2 copies of the plane x. Okay? X describes a plane, right? So there are 2 copies of the plane, okay, but they are joined together. Why? Because around x equal to x1, there is only one y, that's y equal to 0. Right? So around x equal to x1, x is no longer a good coordinate system, okay, because in the local neighborhood of x equal to x1, okay, x describes, the coordinate x describes 2 different points. Okay. Away from x equal to x1 it's not a problem, because it describes 2 different points, but in the local neighborhood it describes one single region. Okay. The other region is somewhere x. But near x equal to x1, the correct choice of coordinate is actually y. Okay. Similarly, near x equal to x2 and near x equal to x3. So the physical picture, okay, is perhaps quite familiar, okay, is that it's a surface with branch parts x1, x2, x3, and going up to infinity. Okay. It's a Riemann surface with branch cuts, okay, and basically there are two copies of this Riemann surface which are glued across these branch cuts. Is this point clear? Because away from these points, right, x is a good coordinate system. Okay? Because in the neighborhood of this, if you want to know what is a good coordinate system, what does that mean? That means that if you specify the coordinate, you specify a single point in that neighborhood. Okay, which is true here. Right? If you specify x in this neighborhood, right, there is only a single point in the neighborhood that represents, right? The other point is far away, outside this neighborhood. However, near these points, that's not the case. Okay? Because if you look at a region near these points, then if you specify x, okay, there are two values of y, okay, which are all in the local neighborhood of this point. Right? So there, one will say that y is a good coordinate system. Okay? So using x and y, you can basically map out the whole region.
Usually in such a kind of equation, changing the number of these constants, I mean x1, x2, x3,
Yes.
you can write down equation for all Riemann surfaces. In Dirac, I mean, putting more factors of x minus.
Yes, yes, but we are not putting more factors of x.
Yes, but they don't have even number of x's.
Yes, but only one of them is at infinity. Right? So if you want to visualize it easier, right, you can always make say an SL2C transformation from the x plane to bring that factor at a finite point. In that case, the equation will look perhaps more familiar. Okay, so I could have written down the equation that way from the beginning. Y square is equal to x minus x1, x minus x2, x minus x3, x minus x4. Okay, then it's clear, right? You have a branch cut, two branch cuts. Okay, x1, x2, x3, x4. I mean, this is basically a special case of that where one of them have gone to infinity. So you have two branch cuts. So if you take one of them to infinity, say export to infinity and scale y, okay, by that root export, you get back that form. So in this form, it's clear, right? It's like two planes, okay, glued across these branch cuts, right? That as you go like this, you go into the next plane. Then in the next plane, when you go like this, you come back to the original plane. The same thing is true here. And this is a torus, right? Two spheres. Okay, why is it a sphere? So far I have not said that it's a sphere. Okay. But now you can see that, yeah. So with this, I'll come back to that. Okay, why it is a sphere when you construct the one form. Okay. If you think of the x as a complex plane with points at infinity identified, then of course it's a sphere. Right? We will see that identifying the points at infinity is compatible with the manipulations we are going to do. So is this clear? Okay, is it clear that this should describe a torus? Right? Two Riemann surfaces, you cut out, you think of this as a plane, right, or a sphere, okay, or two spheres. You cut out, these are the branch cuts, okay, you cut out branch cuts over here and then you glue this with this and this with this, right? It's like sphere with two handles. That's exactly how you describe a torus, right? Topologically it's clearly a torus. Now, one of the things we might want to ask is, given this description, how does it relate to the original description? Okay? Original description being this. Okay. What is this coordinate W in terms of this y and x? Okay, it's a valid question and that can be answered, and the way one answers it is the following. A torus has a holomorphic one form, right? Just like any Calabi-Yau n-fold has an n0 form. right, and a 0 n form. So torus being a Calabi-Yau one-fold has a holomorphic one form. In the W coordinate system, that one form is just dW. Okay? Why? dW is obviously holomorphic, right? It's constant, the coefficient is constant. Right? And it's a well defined one form on the torus, right? Because it's invariant under this periodic identification. W, if you change W to W plus 1 or W plus tau, it doesn't change. So if we could identify the holomorphic one form in this description, then we are done. Right? Then you just identify it equal to dW and we know the relationship between the W coordinate and the XY coordinate system. Sorry, this is dW. So the holomorphic one form in this description is essentially, I think it's dx over y. Okay, we will check why this is the case. Okay, you have to make sure that this is holomorphic. Okay. That means that this has no singularity. Okay, that it first of all has the correct periodic identification. It should have no singularity, okay, under at various points on the torus. Now, clearly away from these points, away from x1, x2, x3, x4, this is perfectly fine, right? There is no singularity because y is determined in terms of x. Okay, and this is a well defined object. What about near x1? Near x1, y vanishes, right? So it looks like singular, right? There is something in the denominator which is vanishing. But you have to remember that near x1, the correct coordinate system is not x, it's y. Right? In a local region around x1, y is the correct way to describe the coordinate system. Right? So you should express this in the non-singular coordinate system, which is y. And it's clear from this description that near x1, right? These are just, if I think of this as just constants. So dx is basically to y dy. So dx is proportional to y dy. Near x equal to x1, x2, x3 or x4. Is this clear? Because near, if you are varying x close to x1, you just think of these as constants, right? x1 minus x2, x1 minus x3, x1 minus x4. So x is basically proportional to y square. So dx goes as y dy. And now you see that this object dx over y goes as dy, and hence it's again non-singular. Okay, in the y coordinate system, it's a perfectly non-singular object. Is this clear? But there is one final check we have to make, okay, which is that at infinity, it has a right behavior, right? See, this is a torus only if we can think of this plane as a sphere. Okay, you have to be able to identify the points at infinity. Okay, so which means that this omega should have certain behavior. This one form should have certain behavior at infinity. Okay, that if you choose the correct coordinate system around infinity, which brings infinity to a finite point, this should look non-singular. Okay, so let's see how that works. So as x goes to infinity, now we have brought everything to finite points. Let's say infinity should be a regular point, no branch cuts here. So as x goes to infinity, y goes as x square. Okay. And hence dw and hence dx over y goes as dx over x square. Is this clear? Because y goes as x square at infinity, right? But this means that you can change coordinates x tilde equal to 1 over x this takes infinity, is an SL2C transformation which brings infinity to 0. Okay, so infinity becomes at a finite, comes to a finite point, x tilde equal to 0 point, but in that coordinate system this is just this x tilde, perfectly regular, right? So x tilde is the right coordinate system around infinity, and what you see is that this one form that you have constructed is perfectly regular at infinity. Okay, so you can really think of infinity as a finite point. So for this reason, it's important that there is a y in the denominator, right? If you had just taken dx, it will of course pass these checks, right? But at infinity it will give problem. So dx over y is a unique form that you can construct, which has all the right properties.
So what if we have homogenized it, and then once you homogenize it, it's sitting inside the projective space,
Yes.
and can we somehow pull back?
Yeah, we could do it that way also, right? Particularly when you do fibration, I mean, we will try to homogenize it, right? But at this stage, it's easiest to think of it this way. Okay, that you use either x or y coordinate system depending on the point where you are working at, okay? And from there you can figure out the relationship, right? So the usual w coordinate system that you are familiar with, okay, is this dx over y. Okay, and the A and the B cycles are basically various cycles going around the branch cards, right? I mean, one of the cycles is, for example, like this, and the other cycle is like this. So one cycle encloses this branch card, other one comes like this, goes to the second Riemann-Schritt, and then comes out from here. This is the A cycle and B cycle. Okay, if maybe I can use this notation, that it's clear that it's in the second Riemann-Schritt, right? This dotted part is in the second Riemann-Schritt, right? So the number of intersections that they have is really just one. Okay? This is a single point at which the A and B cycle intersects. That's the property that the torus has. Right? If you draw a cycle on the torus and the B cycle, right, they intersect at a single point, and you see here that indeed they intersect at a single point, because this part of the curve is in the second Riemann-Schritt, right? Whereas this line is completely in the first Riemann-Schritt.
So in that equation, why is no x square term there?
Oh, because I can always shift x to remove it, right? It's just like convenient description.
So here you are using the whole SL2C somehow.
Yes, so you have used SL2C to bring it into this form, right? Because otherwise, the form will really be like this, right? So what I have done is that I have taken the SL2C transformation, okay, to send x4 to infinity, one of the SL2C transformations, and that still leaves us with some freedom. Okay. And the other freedom then I have used is that I have taken the sum of these three, x1, x2 and x3 to be 0. Right? That's what it means by there is no x squared term. Okay. The coefficient of x squared is the sum of x1, x2 and x3. Okay. So that I have used, the shift symmetry. We still have one more freedom, which is scaling f and g, okay, which you could use to choose some normalization involving f and g. Okay. But we will not do that, okay, for reasons, because there is really no convenient gauge choice. Okay. You cannot set f equal to 1 or g equal to 1, because then you miss out some of the interesting subspaces. Okay. But at a generic value of f and g, right, it's only an appropriate ratio that is important. Right. When you write down the details of the torus, okay, it will become clear. Because we have used two of the three SL2C transformations, right? One is still there, that's just the scaling of f and g. It's clear, right? If you scale, for example, suppose you scale x by lambda, f by lambda square and g by lambda cube, right? And y by lambda to the 3 half, the equation remains unchanged. Right? So scaling f and g together by appropriate powers of lambda, right? F by lambda square and g by lambda cube should give the same torus. Okay, because you can absorb it into a rescaling of the coordinates. Is this clear? Okay, the other thing I wanted to point out here, okay, for this we can go back to this, but we can also work with this. It doesn't matter. That this surface has a discrete Z2 isometry, that is changing y to minus 1, keeping x fixed. Right? That's clearly an isometry of the surface, right? Because if y satisfies this for a given x, then minus y also satisfies the same equation for a given x. Right? So that discrete Z2 isometry must correspond to something on the torus. Okay, and you can ask, what does it correspond to? It's easy to figure out from here, okay, because what does that discrete isometry do? It keeps x unchanged, it changes y to minus 1, right? So this one form changes sign. But in the w coordinate system, this one form is nothing but dw, right? Because that's the way we identify. dw was the holomorphic one form in the w coordinate system, which had this simple structure w plus 1 equal to w plus tau. So it shows that in the w coordinate system, this isometry is just w goes to minus w transformation. Okay, that's always the symmetry of a torus. Okay, because if you replace the coordinate w by minus w, then w will be equivalent to w minus 1, but that's the same as w plus 1. Right? Similarly, w will be equivalent to w minus tau, but that's the same as w plus tau. Emphasize again this point, because this isometry y goes to minus y, x goes to x, which corresponds to w goes to minus w. So this is x goes to x. This is equivalent to SL2Z transformation.
One question. Like,
Yes.
When y goes to minus 1 and x goes to x,
Yes.
in the branch cut picture, there are 3 fixed points, right?
There are 4 fixed points.
Sorry, 4. Okay, 4.
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes.
So what would be the 4 fixed points on? I mean, according to the w coordinates.
Yeah.
One
So
is w equals to
in
0.
yeah, w equal to 0, w equal to half, w equal to tau by 2, and w equal to 1 plus tau by 2, right? Because w equal to half goes to minus half, but that's the same as half, right? So these are the 4 fixed points. So x1, x2, x3, and x4. Yeah, so that's one good point. So x1, x2, x3, and x4, right? These 4 branch points basically are the points 0, half, tau by 2, and 1 plus tau. There is also, of course, a translation invariance on the torus, which is not a little harder to see. At least it doesn't have obvious translation symmetry, okay, but it is possible to point that out. But this is important because, as I said, this symmetry is the SL2Z transformation, that is minus 1, minus 1. Right? Because SL2Z in general acts on the A and the B cycles as A, B, C, D going times the 2 cycles, right? Okay, it mixes up 1 and tau, these 2 cycles. So this minus 1, it doesn't change tau, okay, which is the statement that it leaves the torus unchanged, okay, but it acts on the coordinates of the torus.
So this is acting on which, on x or on what's related to that?
This is acting on the torus coordinates, okay, on the torus. See, SL2Z, the SL2Z of type 2b, see, once you have identified tau with the complex structure modulus of the torus, okay, the SL2Z of type 2b now becomes the SL2Z acting on the torus, right? Now, what is the SL2Z symmetry of the torus? Right? That's the symmetry that allows you to exchange A and B cycles, right? So, minus 1 is the one which changes the sign of A and B cycles, right? So, in the W coordinate system, that means it takes W to minus W. right? Okay, and W2 minus W you have seen is this transformation.
No, that's it. I mean, for example, on tau typically acts as
A tau plus B, yes.
Yeah.
So tau goes to A tau plus B over C tau plus D. Okay. But to see that this is a symmetry, okay, that this is an invariance of that this doesn't change the torus, okay, we have to recall that A, B, C, D, this transformation is actually a geometric transformation on the torus. Okay. What is tau goes to tau plus 1? Tau goes to tau plus 1, okay, is basically declaring that instead of taking this and this as your A and B cycle, we will take this and this as your A and B cycles, right? Tau goes to minus 1 about tau. Similarly is exchanging A and B cycles, right? So what I am saying, in the same spirit, you can ask what does this correspond to, minus 1 minus 1. This is basically changing the sign of both A and B cycles.
we can on x coordinates. I can think of this action on x coordinate as well. I mean, like this and x remaining unchanged.
On these coordinates.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are of course unchanged. Okay, y goes to minus 1, see, those points are all fixed points, right? These points are y equal to 0 points. So y goes to minus y, you will not of course change the fixed points.
No, they will not. I mean, on x plane and SL2Z x, right?
That is SL2C. That has nothing to do with this SL2Z, right? This SL2Z is acting on the torus, right? This one is an action on the A and B cycle, right? How you choose what is your A cycle and what is your B cycle. Right? And what I am saying is that minus 1 is basically that you are changing the orientation of the A cycle and the B cycle. Is that okay?
Yes.
So this is the Z2 res left out when you are considering tau the Mobius transformations. Like, that's basically SL2Z modded out by Z2, right?
Yes, exactly.
So this is Z.
This is the Z, exactly. Right? So a general Mobius transformation will be arbitrary. Okay, A and B cycle are not probably a good idea. A1 and A2 cycles, right? The two cycles of the torus, right? So a general Mobius transformation takes this to A, B, C, D to A1, A2. So for example, the 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, right? That's the transformation tau goes to tau plus 1. That takes A1 to A1 plus A2 and A2 to A2, right? Which basically means that it leaves this cycle unchanged and this cycle to sum of the two. Similarly, tau goes to minus 1 over tau is basically exchange of A1 and A2, right? Because it's 0, 1, minus 1, 0. Okay? That basically says you are interpreting this as the B cycle and this as the A cycle. Yes.
In the xy plane, the y goes to minus 1 and x goes to x, is it like circling one of the zeros?
No, it's a discrete transformation. You can think of it as circling one of the zeros, but you can just think of it as a discrete transformation. Because z goes to minus z is a discrete transformation, right? It tells you to take a point in the z plane and w goes to minus w. Take a point in the w plane and go to minus itself. Okay? So you can think of this as just as a discrete transformation, right? But you can also try to build it as a part of a continuous family. Okay? But that's not what we are discussing immediately right now. Okay? It's just a discrete transformation which takes one point of the torus to another point of the torus. Is this okay? Okay, so some more information is what we need. So I have told you how to make connection between the coordinates on the torus and the coordinates in this xy plane. Okay. But we would also like to know how is the modulus of the torus, tau. What is it in terms of the parameters that we have used here, right? So here the parameters are x1, x2, x3, x4. But I will now go back to that original parameterization that I had used, which is y square equal to x cube plus fx plus g. So tau should be given by somehow a combination of f and g, right? Because this is the data on the torus, right? As you change f and g, you get a different torus because you are moving the location for the branch points. So tau is related to f and g by the following formula. Okay, this I am not going to prove. What is g of tau? G of tau is a fixed well-known function of tau, which is theta 2 of tau to the 8. So theta 2, theta 3 and theta 4 are the Jacobi theta functions. So this is some fixed function of tau, which is what we are calling g of tau. Okay, in fact, I mean g of tau has some specific properties that I am going to describe, and the idea is that this g of tau is related to f and g by this formula. Is this statement clear? Now this function here is modular invariant, okay, which means that this is invariant under tau goes to a tau plus b over c tau plus d, okay, with a b c d as SL2 part of SL2Z transformation. This means that this formula determines tau only up to an SL2Z transformation. Okay? It determines g of tau, okay, but it doesn't determine tau uniquely, right? Because given a tau, any of its modular image, okay, is also a good candidate for the corresponding tau, because g of tau is unchanged. So what are the properties of g of tau? So remember that we had this fundamental domain in the tau plane. Okay, this is the fundamental domain.
So this power of theta function is correct?
Oh. Okay, I'll check this. It doesn't look like.
Because this is 0, right? This is the partition function, one loop partition function of type 2. Plus 8 powers.
No, 4 parts
So
have
that's
been
4 powers.
0.
This is 8.
These are 8 parts,
This
right?
is totally correct.
Yeah, so this is okay. Maybe it's theta 2 to 16, because let's see. These are modular functions with weight 2, weight half, right?
Yeah, downstairs.
Okay, I'll check this part.
Should be whole cube.
Pardon?
Shouldn't there be a whole cube on top on the numerator?
Because you want.
Oh,
24
maybe
powers.
there's a cube, yeah,
Yeah,
right. Yeah, I think this is cube over theta 2 to 24. Okay, but this I'll check. Okay, the point is that these both the numerator and the denominator, they have modular transformations, but the ratio is modular invariant. Okay, so what g of tau does is it takes this fundamental domain and maps it to the whole complex plane in a one-to-one fashion. Okay, which basically means that given a complex value of j, okay, any value of this quantity, we can determine a point here in a unique fashion. Okay, it maps this region to the complex plane in a one-to-one fashion, which means, or more specifically, the Riemann sphere okay, where you also have the point at infinity added. Okay, it maps this domain to the Riemann square in a one-to-one fashion, which means that given the value of g of tau, any complex value of g of tau, there is one and only one point in this fundamental domain, okay, which solves this equation. Well, one and only one point, of course, is little misleading because there are points in this fundamental domain which are also identified, right? For example, you know that this part is identified with this point, right? So you will of course pick one of those points.
Sorry, this.
Yeah, the tau goes to minus 1 over tau, for example, will identify.
And also this.
Yeah, also on base, exactly. The tau goes to tau plus 1, right?
So near so near tau equal to tau equal to I and tau equal to the points in the middle. So it will be like j tau will be behaving like tau square and tau cube.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not tau cube. Tau
Yeah, they'll be branching. Yeah, but the correct thing to do is to hold it, right? So that you really think of this as a one-to-one representation of the fundamental region. Right? You identify this means you have folded. You also identify this, and then yeah, there is topologically a sphere, and it maps that sphere to the sphere of the complex plane in a one-to-one fashion.
But sphere when you're playing, you don't have the point at infinity.
Yeah, so point at infinity is also here. Tau equal to I infinity is considered as 1 point.
But if we identify that, so once we identify that,
Well, that only then it will be a plane. Okay. So when I said we'll see what that means in this language. Okay. So let's ask the following question: if this gives the complex plane in a one-to-one fashion, right? There must be a point which maps to infinity. Right? Because infinity is also a point in the complex plane.
you want complex plane of CP1.
Sphere, CP1, yeah, sphere. Okay. So CP1 includes the value infinity, right? Okay. Point at infinity on the plane is part of the part of CP1, right? Okay. So if this map is 1 to 1, then given the value infinity, there must be a tau. Okay. What tau is that? That tau is I infinity. Okay. So the correct way to say is if you define q as equal to 2 pi I tau, then j goes as 1 over q as tau goes to I. So you say that as a function, as a modular function, it actually has a pole at I infinity. And basically, it also goes the other way. Okay? That once you say that j is a function, okay, with a pole, okay, this is a modular function with a pole, okay, then it fixes j more or less uniquely, okay, except that you can scale it and you can shift it. Okay? If you have a modular function, okay, then you can scale it, it still remains a modular function. You can add some constant to it, it remains a modular function. So up to those ambiguities, it's a unique function. So j, so those you can fix by saying that j of e to the I pi by 3 is 0 and j of I is given before q. Okay, these will not be very useful for us, but this is just to say that these are some properties of j. And if I say that j is a unique modular function with these properties, that fixes j uniquely. Okay, you don't have to give this formula also. Okay, there is a unique modular function with these properties. But the point of this should be clear that this means that given f and g, we can find what the corresponding modular parameter is.
So in general, any modular form can be generated by taking fractional linear combinations of j.
Any function of j, right? Yes. So if you
Sorry,
yeah.
any modular function.
Any modular function with poles.
With people.
With pole, one pole, right? Because it has a pole. Right? So what you can do is that by taking a fractional linear transformation, you can try to bring the pole somewhere else. Okay, because just like J has a pole, because J is a map in a one-to-one fashion, right? J also has a 0, right? Or J plus 1 also has a 0. J plus any constant has a 0. So if you make a fractional linear transformation, okay, somewhere there will be a pole. But is an important point. And J has this nice property that it blows up precisely as tau goes to I infinity. Okay, I infinity is basically the weak coupling digit. Are there any questions? Okay, so far then we have considered a fixed torus. Okay, now we want to go back to our problem of elliptic fibration. We want to fiber this a torus over a plane, okay, or over a sphere, which is a base. And the question we would like to ask, okay, the question that we started asking is how should tau vary as a function of the base coordinates so that the result is a Calabi-Yau manifold. But now that the information about tau is encoded in F and G, we can ask the question how should F and G vary as a function of the base coordinate so that we have the total space is a Calabi-Yau manifold. So torus fibered over is 2. So we allow F and G to be function of the base coordinates. So total space is given by y square is equal to x cube plus f of z times x plus g of z. So this now is to be regarded as an equation in one equation in three variables, three complex variables. Okay, one equation in x, y, z. So this gives you two complex dimensional manifold, dimensional space. And the question that you would like to ask is when is this two?
Do we demand F and G to be finite everywhere on the sphere?
Well, not necessarily. We don't have to. Right? Total space should be non-singular. Right? So right now, let's ask when consider the case when the total space is non-singular. Right? But of course, there are singular K3s, right, which should be thought of as limits of this general construction. Okay. From the beginning, if you start with singular K3, things will become confusing. So let's try to look for non-singular space. Right? Total space should be non-singular. Okay, but this vibration can become singular sometimes. Now I'll give you the answer and then show how this comes about. this is assuming that the z equal to infinity point is in the fiber is okay at z equal to infinity, right? That we can always assume. Okay, otherwise, if there is singularity, we make an eccentricity transform to move the. Okay. So the reason that we need this 8 versus 12, right? Okay. That if this is some polynomial, this is going to be let's see for what is it, 3 half times that polynomial, right? That basically follows from the structure, right? Because as z goes to infinity, if g of z grows, f of z grows, if you want the whole space to be non-singular, right, then those infinities must be removable by rescaling y and x. Okay, for this, it's necessary that if this, once you say that this grows as degree 8, it's clear that this has to grow as degree 12. Okay, otherwise, at infinity, there will be some problem. But how do we arrive at this 8? Okay, why not 4 and 6? Yeah, so the point is that we want z equal to infinity to be a regular point. Okay, nothing should go wrong there. Okay, even in there should be no coordinate singularity also, right? Let's say that z equal to infinity, fiber should be perfectly fine. But what we see from here is that if we take z equal to infinity and suppose this growth f and g are polynomials, they are going to infinity, right? So it looks like that this equation becomes ill-defined. But if we can scale y and x to remove that infinity, okay, then of course we are back to a regular surface. And for that it is necessary that if this goes as z to the 8, as z goes to infinity, we can scale that, we can absorb that into x, but then this has to go as z to the 12. Okay, so that all the terms scale in the same way, and you can factor it out.
Somehow x goes as z to the 4.
Pardon?
X goes as z to the 4.
Yeah, then this will have to go as z to the 6. Yeah, so this 8 I have not explained yet, right? But what I am saying is that once I say this is 8, this has to be 12. Okay, if you want the z equal to infinity points to be regular, right? Because you should be able to scale x and you should be able to remove those infinities, okay, basically into a rescaling of x and y.
So you want to think of this equation in some projective space. You will identify.
Yeah, because z equal to infinity, because you are thinking of the base as a sphere, right? So z equal to infinity should be a regular point.
Yes.
Okay. So at z equal to infinity, nothing should happen to the fiber.
But we are scaling x, y, z together and in such a way that any scaling doesn't affect, it cancels.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
So there's a weighted projective space.
Okay. Right now we are not thinking of this as a weighted projective space. Right? All I am saying is that this equation has to be satisfied. Right? So if you multiply this equation by anything, right, it is still 0.
Yeah.
Right? So this equation, if individual terms in this equation become large, okay, that's not an indication that the equation, there's something wrong with the equation. Okay? Because you may be able to change coordinates to remove it, right? Now here what will happen is that if you take z to infinity, right, suppose this is f and g are becoming large. Okay? That doesn't necessarily mean that there is something wrong with the surface, because that may be just a coordinate singularity, you may be able to just scale coordinates to remove it. Okay? And all I am saying is that if this goes as z to the 8, and if this goes as z to the 12, or if this goes as z to the 4 and this goes as z to the 6, you can always scale x and y, okay, to just remove it. Right? Because suppose this, let's suppose that this goes as, suppose f goes as f naught z to the alpha, and this goes as g naught z to the 3 half alpha, right? Okay, then as z goes to infinity, these coefficients are going to infinity. However, you can take a scaling y as y tilde z to the power, let's see what should we do here. So this is y should go as 3/4 alpha, x should go as x tilde z to the power cube. So 2. Yeah, so suppose you make this change of coordinate. Okay, y as y tilde z to the 3/4 alpha, x as x tilde z to the power alpha y. Then in this new coordinate system, it will look like z to the power 3/2 alpha times y tilde square, and x cube is z to the 3/2 alpha times x tilde cube, plus here this is z to the alpha, this is z to the power alpha by 2, so again z to the power 3/2 alpha f naught x tilde plus z to the 3/2 alpha g naught. Okay. So z to the 3/2 alpha you basically can factor out, and you see that the equation takes the form y tilde square equal to x tilde cube plus f x tilde plus f naught x tilde plus g naught, okay, which is a perfectly, which has no infinity anytime. So this is the reason, because you want z equal to infinity to be a regular point, right? Then nothing should happen there. Okay, we require that if f grows a certain power of z, then g should go as 3/2 of that power. Is this point clear? If g had any other power, you couldn't have done this, right? All of these would be still blowing up. Okay, but now let's try to understand why is it 8 and 12.
Will it be only the large z?
Yes, when I say it's a polynomial of degree 8, right? That means it has z to the 8 plus all lower powers.
But if I add some function which is not polynomial but is
Well, then the function will have other poles, right? On a z plane, right? If you add functions other than polynomial, then those will have singularities in the z plane, and then you have to worry about whether those and what happens at those singularities. Right? That's why you are choosing polynomials.
But if it has if the polynomial has multiple powers of z, I mean, in terms of different powers of z, then the scaling thing might not hold, right?
No, scaling, when you take z goes to infinity,
Only in that case.
only the leading term, yeah, so we are only wanting to make sure that z equal to infinity
So,
is
sensible.
perfectly fine, right? The sensible point, there's nothing goes wrong in that point. Right? So that's why you are taking the z goes to infinity, right? And here we can scale out this, okay, which basically shows that z equal to infinity is perfectly regular. So starting from this, of course, then you can ask what happens if you adjust the coefficients of the polynomial, okay, so that the coefficient of z to the 8 goes to 0, say. Okay. And then you can ask whether this still describes a regular object or not, regular surface or not. Okay. But when you say at a generic surface, right, it will be a polynomial of degree 8 and 12. There will be special points in the moduli space where the coefficient of the z to the 8 terms will go to 0. Right? And then I have to do a separate analysis to see whether that describes a regular point or not. Okay, so now to understand why is it 8 and 12, we'll regard the base as CP1. Okay? So we'll think of the base as a projective space, okay, labeled by two coordinates z1 and z2 instead of just a single coordinate z, okay, and we have a scaling symmetry that identifies z1 z2 to lambda z1 lambda z. So regard the base as CP1 so the coordinates are z1 z2 with the identification that this is the same as lambda z1 lambda z2. Okay. So now if we go back to this formula over here, this Z is essentially now Z1 over Z2. So I can write y square is equal to x cube plus f of Z1 over Z2 x plus g of Z1 over Z2. And this is a polynomial of degree 8, this is a polynomial of degree 12. Okay? But we don't want to have things in the denominator. Okay? Because Z2 equal to 0 is also a perfectly good point, right? So what we do is that we multiply the whole thing, multiply by Z2 to the 12 and define y times Z2 to the 6 as y tilde and x times Z2 to the 4 as x tilde. So now let's see how the equation looks. So this y square Z2 to the 12, that is y tilde square, x cube times Z2 to the 12, that's x tilde cube. This one has been multiplied by Z2 to the 12, but this was a polynomial of degree 8. Okay? So there is at most Z2 to the 8 power in the denominator, right? So what we do is that we keep the Z2 to the 8 of the Z2 to the 12 to make this into a polynomial in Z1 and Z2, and the Z2 to the 4 we absorb inside x to make it x tilde. So I can write this as f8 of Z1 Z2 times x tilde plus G8 G12 of Z1 Z2, where f8 is the homogeneous polynomial now. Homogeneous polynomial of degree 8 in Z1 Z2, and G12 is a homogeneous polynomial of degree 12 in Z1 Z2. Is this clear? Okay, we have just rearranged terms and absorbed some of the Z2 factors inside the coordinates. So this is what we will take as a defining relation for the surface. Okay, forget about the original xy coordinate system. This is what we will take as a defining relation. X, y, z1, z2 are complex coordinates. So 4 complex coordinates, one equation. Okay, that doesn't sound quite right. It's still 3 complex dimensional, but you have to remember that you have an identification. Z1, z2 was the same as lambda z1, z2. Okay. But in fact, because y tilde and x tilde have absorbed some powers of z1, z2, okay, the full scaling relation is the following: x tilde y tilde z1, z2 is lambda x has absorbed z to the 4, so lambda to the 4 x tilde lambda to the 6 y tilde z1, z2. Okay, this is the identification. 4 complex coordinates, one identification, one equation. So that gives you back 2 complex dimensional space.
Lambda Z.
Lambda, sorry, lambda Z1. So this is what one normally calls weighted projective space. Why weighted projective space? Here all the coordinates don't have the same weight. Okay? A projective space would have been when all of them have the same weight. This is weighted projective space because different coordinates have different weight. So this generalizes the normal notion of projective space. Okay? So you can think of this as a weighted projective space, and this one, this equation is a hypersurface in the weighted projective space. It's one condition on the weighted projective space. Now, if you remember, we have encountered a similar situation before, okay, not in the context of weighted projective space, but just for projective space, when we considered a Calabi-Yau manifold, okay, as a polynomial in CPN, right? Okay. And there the formula, okay, for vanishing first Chern class, C1 equal to 0, was equivalent to the condition that the degree of the polynomial equal to sum of coordinates, sum of weights of homogeneous coordinates. Okay, we wrote down a more general formula, okay, of the Chern class, but in particular C1 equal to 0 is the condition that the degree of the polynomial, quintic in CPN, right, degree of the polynomial is 5, okay, and CPN, okay, of course is ordinary projective space, so each coordinate has weight 1, okay. So quintic in CP5 is what CP4 is what we considered. CP4 has 5 homogeneous coordinates, right, each with weight 1, okay. So that's the reason we got C1 equal to 0. Degree of the polynomial was 5 homogeneous coordinates, each of weight 1, that gave 0. It turns out that the same condition tells us when this surface is Calabi-Yau, namely that the weight of the polynomial, if there is more than one polynomial, you have to add up the weights. Okay, here there is only one polynomial. The weight of the polynomial should be equal to the sum of the degrees of the coordinates.
When you say polynomial, you take all the terms in one side and think of.
Yes, all the terms in one side, because both sides are homogeneous, right? I mean, they scale in the same way. Okay, otherwise it doesn't make sense to as an equation in the weighted projective space. So now we are in business, so let's add up and count. Okay. The sum of the weights, x tilde has weight 4, right? Yeah, x tilde has weight 4 plus 6 plus 1 plus 1. This is the sum of the weights of the coordinates. What about the degree of the polynomial? Well, the degree, this is the polynomial. Well, not this. This is the polynomial. And each term in this polynomial has degree 12. Y tilde has degree 6, right? So y tilde square has degree 12. You can easily check that each of them have degree 12. So indeed this is equal to 12. And this is what guarantees that this space, okay, the space that you get by writing this equation in this space is Calabi-Yau two-fold. And you can easily convince yourself that if you, instead of 8, you have taken 4 and 6, it wouldn't work. Okay, you can take alpha and 3 of alpha and do this analysis, and you will find that the unique value of alpha which makes this work is this one, that it has to be degree 8 and degree 12.
Just by keeping this function with arbitrary coefficients like we did in the previous case, this gives you number of complex structure deformations of.
Yes, so this gives you.
This counting works correctly.
Yeah, so but except that you will not get the full set of K3.
Oh, it's not a full case.
This is a moduli space of elliptically fibered K3.
And that matches correctly.
Yeah, so the complex structure moduli space of elliptically fibered K3 is the number of deformations of this polynomial, because f and g of course have several unknown coefficients, right? And then you also have to ask if some of them can be removed by coordinate change.
Just CP1.
Yeah.
So you can,
Exactly. Right? So using that you can figure out.
and then it's correct, it matches.
Yeah, it correctly matches the total number of elliptically, the total moduli space of elliptically fibered K3. Are there any questions? So we have F8 and G12. Okay, these are all functions of Z1, Z2. Okay, in fact now we can also go back to the Z coordinate system. So now if we want to know how tau varies as a function of Z, G of tau of Z, Z is Z1 over Z2, right? Okay, this of course is not about coordinate system near Z2 equal to 0, which is Z equal to infinity, but let's keep that in mind and not worry about it too much. So this will be, according to our formula, 24 cube times 4 f of Z cube over 4 f of Z cube plus 27 g of Z square. Okay, I could have also written this as Z1 and Z2. Okay, Z1 and Z2 and Z1 and Z2. But it's clear that this ratio, okay, is homogeneous of degree 0. Right? Because f is homogeneous of degree 8, this is homogeneous of degree 12. Okay, so this ratio is homogeneous of degree 0, right? So it's really a function of Z1 over Z. That's how I've written it as f of Z. Is this clear? So given this polynomials f of Z and g of Z, we can figure out what tau of Z is by this formula, by inverting this formula. The denominator is important. Okay, so this we will call delta of Z. This is a polynomial of degree 24. Okay. So in a generic situation, it has 24 zeros. Yeah, it's a polynomial of degree 24, so on the Z plane it has 24 zeros. So what will those zeros represent? At those zeros, J goes to infinity. Right? So what does it say for tau? Tau goes to I infinity. Right? It goes to weak coupling region, right? Or it's SL to Z dual. We will see later that these can be interpreted as the positions of the 7 branes in the 2B language. Why? Because we have seen that if we have a D7 brane, then at the core of the D7 brane, coupling goes to I infinity, tau goes to I infinity, right? We had solved the equations for the presence of D7 branes at log of Z minus Z naught, and at the core, okay, tau goes to I infinity. So these may not be D7 branes, this is other D7 brane or one of its SL2Z image. Okay, but we will discuss this in some detail later.
What's the significance of the number 24?
Well, it just comes out that it has to be 24. Okay, we'll see later that this 24 is essentially a reflection of the fact that the base is the sphere. Okay, that if you want a point at infinity to have regular behavior, then you need this degree 24. We have already seen that, after all, this fact that we got these polynomials of certain degree, okay, came from both requirement of Calabi-Yau condition as well as the fact that Z equal to infinity is a regular point. Okay. So, if you try to change this number, right, suppose you make it 30 instead of 24, okay, Z equal to infinity will not be a regular point. Is this clear? Now let me just write down a special case, okay, and I will stop because this special case will be what will be discussed next time in some detail. Special case will be say f of z is a times h of z square g of z a times b times h of z cube, where h of z is polynomial of degree 4. Okay, h of z, if f is a polynomial of degree 8, right, and if f is given by this, then h better be polynomial of degree 4, a and b are constants. Is this clear? So H in general will have a form as product I equal to 1 to 4 Z minus Zi. The overall normals are set equal to 1 because that can always be absorbed inside A. What is the significance of this? You see that if we choose f and g this way, then j of tau from this fz cube will be proportional to hz to the 6. This will be proportional to hz to the 6, this will also be proportional to hz to the 6. Okay. So z dependence cancels out completely, this becomes 24 cube times 4 over 4a cube over 4a cube is 27b square. So tau will be constant on the sphere, on the base. So if you are trying to compactify F theory on elliptically fibered K3, okay, which basically is a compactification of type 2b on a sphere, okay, with varying tau, then in the moduli space of that theory, okay, there is a spatial point or a spatial class of points where f and g are chosen this way, where it will describe type 2b compactification on a sphere with constant tau. Okay, tau doesn't change as you move on the sphere. Okay, it's type 2b compactification on the sphere with constant tau. Is that clear? right? Because tau has to be interpreted as the axial electron modulus of type 2. This sounds a little strange because if tau is constant, right, then we had argued that the base better be Calabi-Yau. We will see that this compactification is exactly the orientifold of type 2 beyond T2 that we studied in detail. At the specific point in the moduli space, the orientifold, you remember, there are 4 fixed points. The point in the moduli space of the orientifold that this describes is where each of those 4 fixed points has, let's see, 4 d-branes on top. There are altogether 16 d-branes we need, right? Each of those 4 orientifold fixed planes have 4 d-branes on top, so that the charge is cancelled neutrally, locally, and hence tau is constant, right? That was particular point in the that was the orientifold plane, orientifold compactification, for which also tau was constant, right? The base was had the shape of a tetrahedron, if you remember, right? After you compactify, after you model out by the orientifolding, the base was a tetrahedron, and at each vertex of the tetrahedron we had an orientifold plane and 4 d-branes sitting there. Okay. We will argue next time that that compactification is identical to what we have here.
4 points are 4 Zis?
Yes, the 4 points are the 4 Zis.
How do we see tau is constant? We have seen that J of tau is.
Yeah, J of tau is constant, but J maps it in one-to-one fashion, right? So, unless tau jumps discontinuously, right, tau is constant. Okay, otherwise tau has to jump from somehow to its image. Is this clear? Okay, so next time we will study this in detail. Right? We will see why, in particular, this describes an orientifold, because what we have to show is to make sure that when you go around, see what are the features of the orientifold, right? That when you go around any of these vortex, you make an SL2Z transformation by -1, -1. Right? The base should have conical defects at these 4 points. Okay, I have not written down the metric on the base for this. Okay, we will write down the metric on the base for this particular F-theory compactification, and we will see that indeed there are conical defects exactly of the kind that we had for orientifold. Okay. So, at this special point in the moduli space, this describes exactly what orientifold describes, and then we will go on to study what happens when you deform it. Right? Now imagine that we don't have F and G exactly given by this, but something similar to this, okay, with some small corrections. How does it compare to what we had seen in orientifolds? Yes.
Question. We started out compactifying R61 cross CY2.
Well, R61, it's not cross CY2. R61, okay, R71 cross the base. That's the compactification, right?
Okay, yeah.
That it's 8 non-compact dimension,
Right.
non-quantum space-time dimension plus 2-dimensional base.
So they, I mean, at these singular points,
Yes.
it had to be D7 branes. It couldn't have been anything else.
Yes, I agree. Yes. I mean, it has to be 7 branes, right? But we will see that it's not necessarily D7 branes, right? But geometrically, it has to, I mean, whatever happens at the singular points, right? Its translation is invariant along the 7 plus 1 dimension, right? So it better extend along those directions. But we will see that not all of these have will have interpretation as D7 branes. Right? Not all the singularities will have interpretation as D7 branes. Some of those singularities, in fact, of this 24, right? The 24 zeros here, right? 16 of them will represent D7 branes. 8 will pair up and describe the 4 orientifold planes. Okay, so each orientifold plane will be described by a pair of these zeros. Okay, but that we will see later. At this stage, of course, everything has coincided, right? So you cannot really distinguish. But you can see that each point here, each Zi, right, really represents 6 zeros of delta, right? Because delta will be proportional to Z minus Zi to the 6. Right? It's clear from this structure. So each Zi has 6 zeros. So 6 zeros together represent an orientifold plane and 4 D7 branes, right? Because on the orientifold side you really have at each of the vertex you have one orientifold plane, 4 D7 branes, right? So if 4 D7 branes are taken away, right? If 4 of the zeros are 4 D7 branes, then each orientifold plane must correspond to 2 of these zeros.
But don't we have a local, charge cancellation? Orientifold plane have charge minus 4 times the D brane.
Yes, so for this configuration, yes, you have local charge cancellation.
But if we have 2 orientifold planes,
No. For this configuration, right, each Zi is a location of an orientifold plane plus 4 D7 planes. Right? That's why a local charge cancellation from orientifold side. And you also see local charge cancellation in this F theory because tau is constant. Right? If you didn't have local charge cancellation, then tau should vary, right? Okay. So at this point, it's clear that each of these 4 vortex charge must have been cancelled locally. So if it has any interpretation in terms of orientifold pattern, it better be that each vortex represents one orientifold plane plus 4 D7 branes, because that's what cancels charge. But of course I have not shown it here. Right? Next time we will discuss why this is indeed the orientifold description. Okay, a priori this could be a completely different compactification of the atom.